Welcome to this year's Giving USA live webinar with Dunham and Company. I'm your host, Rick Dunham, founder and chair of Dunham and Company. And we're grateful that you've joined us today for what is going to be a very interesting presentation. The data coming out of 2022 is, to say the least, very fascinating. And I'm delighted that my good friend and colleague, Osili, is going to be here to join us today and present. Now, I could give you all of her credentials. She's an amazing researcher, academic, and a real leader in the field of philanthropy in America and actually globally. And it's been my pleasure to know Una now for over a decade. At the end of today's webinar, she and I will take some time for question and answer. So during that time, do as Greg said earlier, make sure you put any of your questions in the Q&A, and we'll make sure to take those as they come. So without any further delay, I'd like to ask Una to join us and take it from here. Una.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you to all our colleagues at Dunham and Company for making this webinar possible. And I also want to just welcome all of you who've joined us from all over to unpack these results. As Rick shared, Giving USA is the most comprehensive and longest running report on charitable giving in the US. But we are at interesting times. As all of you will know, our nation and our world combined have lived through some unprecedented circumstances, a global pandemic like no other, an economic crisis, and also an ongoing conversation about racial justice and equity in our communities. So with all of that in mind, our team worked extraordinarily hard this year, not just to fine-tune and understand the results, but to go behind the scenes and really understand what's driving giving. And what does this mean, not just for 2022 and 2023, but even in the years ahead? What does all of this mean for all of us? And so today's presentation will focus on what do these results mean for your organization, your fundraising, and your ability to reach your mission and accomplish your goals. So we're going to get started by looking at the very big picture. How did the landscape change following all of these unprecedented shifts that I've just identified? I'm going to start with this very big picture. So we have some good news in the report, as well as some challenges ahead. So first, charitable giving reached the new number for giving in America is $499 billion. I want to repeat that number because every time we say that, I think it does lead a lot of people to understand that generosity is by far a common trait that unites Americans. So 499, almost $500 billion. And what we've also noted is that because of all the changes that we've seen, we did have a global pandemic, we did have an economic crisis, and we also had lots of shifts in the giving landscape. Giving actually declined in 2022. A lot of that can be explained by the stock market and also high levels of inflation. So there is good news. Giving is it's alive. Americans are generous. Giving has been resilient during the pandemic, but the last year was a challenging year for giving, and we ended the year with a decline in charitable giving after very high levels of giving set during the global pandemic. Now let's look at those numbers in more detail. Where did the giving come from? By far, the biggest contributor to American philanthropy is individuals. And when we rewind the tape and see what giving looked like in the 1980s, another period of very high inflation, we note that individuals were still the biggest segment of American philanthropy. But if you look at those numbers even more closely, you'll see that the individual segment has actually shrunk considerably. It was 80% and over in the 80s. It was even higher in the 50s and 60s. Today, it's at 64%, which means individuals still have to be the centerpiece. They are the lion's share of American philanthropy. But increasingly, fundraisers will have to pay attention to other vehicles, other sources of giving, in particular foundations. Foundations have grown over the last 40 years. Today, foundations make up 21% of all giving, which is basically 1 out of every 5 charitable dollars today comes from a foundation. Bequests have also maintained a significant footprint in American philanthropy. So this is the time to continue to pay attention to planned giving, especially because we do know that in the United States and around the world, we have an aging population. Many of those households are reaching their prime giving years and are very interested in making long-term commitments to the causes and institutions they care about. And then finally, corporate giving. This is a very interesting segment of giving because when you look at the numbers, it looks like, wow, corporations have stayed relatively the same. It was 5% in the 80s. It's about 6% today. And that might look like there's been a lot of consistency. I think the common thread is that corporations have remained committed to American philanthropy. We saw many companies step up their generosity during the COVID pandemic, and that has continued. The last few years, also some good news for corporations. Corporate pre-tax profits have grown, which has meant for many companies, they are in a good position to make commitments to charitable organizations. However, as you look at that stability and peel back the layers, what we've also noted is that many companies are becoming more strategic in their giving. They're identifying cause areas that they want to focus in, and they're reaching innovative models with the nonprofits that they're partnering with. Some of that means workplace giving campaigns. For other companies, it's cause marketing. You all know about the Tom's shoes. You buy one and one goes to a person in need of shoes. In addition, companies are experimenting with impact investing, with sponsorships, and approaches that may not be traditional charitable giving. What this means for your organization is increasingly revenue diversification is the name of the game. You hear this all the time. It starts with individuals. Individuals make up not just the main segment of giving, but if we were to add individual giving, half of the foundation segment, and all of the charitable bequests, we would have about 85% of all giving being controlled and decisions made by individuals. So while it looks like the map is shifting, there is still a through line through this data, which means individuals have to be the main focus of all nonprofits, and reaching those individuals has to be one of our priorities in the year ahead. As we turn to the next slide, our team spent a lot of time with the data this year, not just with the 2022 data, but looking ahead and also looking at other years and how this year compares with other records that we've seen. So as we look at where all the giving goes, this is also an area where we've seen significant shifts taking place. Religious congregations are still by far the biggest recipient of American philanthropy, with about 27% of all giving going to religious congregations. Now, when we look at this data in a larger perspective, you will note that in the 50s and 60s, when Giving USA first started, actually 2/3 of all American philanthropy went to religious congregations. So there has been significant disruption in how much is going to congregations. However, what we know from the data is that faith still informs a lot of giving, and many Americans give because of their values, often informed by their own religious traditions. In addition, many nonprofits, whether in health, in education, in human services, are guided by religious organizations or principles. So this is not to say that religious values and institutions don't exert an enormous influence in American philanthropy, but these are the shifts we're seeing in the data. I also want to lift up giving to international causes and the environment. These are two subsectors that have grown significantly in the last few decades, and it's worth noting that Giving USA did not track international giving or environmental giving in the 50s, 60s, 70s, or even in the 80s. In fact, the first year these two sectors were tracked was 1987. I also want to point out that in the Giving USA data this year, we noted that education, which is usually the second recipient, largest recipient of charitable giving, is actually more in line with human services now. And this reflects the fact that during the pandemic, we did see record giving going to human services. And some of the shift that we're seeing here reflects the pandemic era highs set in giving to human services and some of the other subsectors. So taken together, the main message here is that we are living in a time where it is not static. There's lots of change taking place, and American households are prioritizing certain causes as they make their charitable decisions. Now, moving to the next slide. Now that you've seen the big picture, we're going to now spend some time answering the behind the scenes questions. I'm going to take you behind the data to understand why are these trends shifting and what does this mean for your organization. The main explanation for what we saw in 2022 was the economy. I want to start by celebrating some of the numbers here. Giving reached the $500 billion mark for the first time in our history of tracking giving. In particular, the pandemic era, as you can see, led to record levels of giving, not just for overall giving, but many of the subsectors that we study. When we adjust for inflation, 2020, the pandemic year, and 2021 were some of the best years we've had on record. However, as we moved into 2022, we reached some challenges, and I just want to point out two of those. The first one is inflation. Inflation reached a 40-year high in 2022 at 8%, which meant that many organizations, even when they were raising the same amount that they had raised in the past, they were not able to keep pace with the inflationary pressures in the economy. Similarly, towards the end of the year, the stock market declined. In fact, year over year by about 22% or 26%, depending on which index you're looking at. What this means is that for many households, 2022 was characterized by economic uncertainty. We know that households give when they have the financial and economic resources to give, and also when they feel certain about their economic situations. For fundraisers, as we move into 2023 and beyond, it's going to be important to pay attention to these economic indicators and understand where households are. No one recession affects everyone the same, so customizing your approach to align with the households and understand their own economic situations. Now, moving to the next slide, I'd like to share some more about how we are thinking about what these economic data mean for every organization, and especially for those of you who've joined us today. On the next slide, we have a range of economic data that we will present. And you might pause and say, how are we supposed to think about all of these different indicators? 2022 was an unusual year. I'll just start by saying that on the challenging side, we had inflation reach 8%, which is the highest rate in 40 years. Many of us have not lived through a period of high inflation as what we experienced in 2022. At the same time, the stock market also declined, which meant for some households, 2022 was a challenging year. Despite these challenges, however, there were some very bright spots. GDP overall grew by 9%. And so even after we adjust for inflation, we still had growth in GDP. And one of the best news coming out of 2022 was that unemployment reached one of its lowest rates in the last 50 years. If you put all this data together, and those of us who are working in the field have to look at all this in totality, is recognizing that some households are doing just fine in this economy, and this is a great time to build relationships and develop opportunities for those households to give. At the same time, it's important to understand there are pockets of weakness in our economy. And there are many households that are facing these challenges where their dollars are not going as far as they did before. And for fundraisers, nonprofit leaders, and those who are working with organizations, it's important to put all of this economic data into your decision-making as you plan for the future, as you develop proposals, and also as you adjust and make adjustments throughout the course of the year. Now, moving to the next slide, I feel pretty strongly that as we look at 2022 data, there's so much to discuss, so much to reflect on, and so many implications to draw on. And the way to look at this data is to actually say, inflation had an impact on all segments of giving, but it wasn't a uniform approach. In particular, we saw that corporations performed the best. In fact, they were one of the brightest spots in the giving landscape. They grew at 3.8% in current dollars. And when we adjust for inflation, you can see that it did not keep pace with inflation, but it was still our best performing data. Foundations were also another relative bright spot in this year's data. Why? Because as many of you know, foundations use a rolling average. Sometimes it's a 2-3 year rolling average to make decisions. So current conditions are not necessarily the only factor in how foundations make decisions. For many companies and foundations, the pandemic era was characterized not just by a commitment to giving and a stepping up in generosity, but also in new models that were tested. We saw many corporations and foundations use unrestricted models around their giving, more flexible grant making, and also a willingness to expand their approaches to grant making, more trust-based and more flexible. In addition, when we look at the individual segment, it was by far the most affected by the economic conditions. Now, as we turn our attention to this is what 2022 looked like, but now we have to turn the page and start thinking about what are the opportunities ahead and what does this mean for your organization. Let's start with the opportunities. As you know, fundraising means working with all of the segments of giving, but by far the place to start and the most important segment is the individual segment. During the pandemic era, we saw individual giving reach new record levels, and this is a point to celebrate. It was giving by large donors, but also giving by everyday donors. With the large donors, we had donors like Scott that set new records, not just in the dollar amount, $6 billion alone in 2020, but also in how they gave. Scott, all her giving was unrestricted. Many of the organizations that received those gifts were not required to submit proposals or reports. So this is a new, you could say a new model for engaging with nonprofits. And many organizations and donors are finding that having those more unrestricted approaches allows the organization to deliver on its mission in a more flexible format, especially during these fast-changing times. In addition, we saw that everyday donors also responded. Many households saw need in their communities during the pandemic, and they stepped up and stepped forward in many ways. So in-kind giving, of course, cash, but also this expanded way of looking at philanthropy. We used to talk about the 3 T's, time, time, talent, and treasure. Today, we've added testimony and ties, meaning individuals are willing to use all of their resources to support the causes they care about. So the main message for all of you who are joining today is, as you think about how you navigate these turbulent economic times that we live in, it's still by far the most timely thing to do is to engage individuals, understanding that individuals vary in their capacity to give, their financial circumstances, and also the causes that matter to them. But we also live in an era where there are a lot of opportunities to engage individuals. Now let's turn to what the challenge is as we contemplate the role of individual giving. As I noted, individual giving grew during the pandemic, but what we have also been tracking over time is the share of individual giving as a total compared to disposable income. So how much of households' disposable income are they allocating to charitable giving? And what we see here is that for the most part, it's hovered around 2%. And what we've often asked ourselves and posed to the sector overall is, what would we as nonprofit leaders, as fundraisers, and those who care about philanthropy, what would we have to do differently to move the needle? You can see that in the current period, it has actually gone down. And when you compare it to the biblical mandate of 10% of your income, you see that Americans really have a long way to go. And during this period, we've seen more of household income allocated to housing, to food, to basic necessities, but also to entertainment, to technology, and to many other discretionary sources. So it's a really good time to ask, what could we do to inspire donors to allocate more of their income, understanding that we face so many challenges, not just here in the United States, but around the world. And philanthropy has an opportunity in this moment to make a big difference. Now, turning our attention to the next slide, let's also look at a portion of the philanthropic landscape that did show relative strength during this period. The pandemic era was characterized by extraordinary generosity, where many companies not just stepped up, but they stepped forward and implemented new ways of giving, employee-based giving, virtual volunteering. Some of it is, of course, cash-based, in-kind, but also utilizing the talent base and the platform that the company has to advance the causes and the nonprofits they care about. But as we track this data and look at, on the next slide, how much of corporate giving measured as a share of overall pre-tax profit, we note that corporate giving as a share of corporate pre-tax profits has actually gone down. It's at less than 1%. And when we look back at the data from the 70s, 60s, and even in the 80s, this was much closer to 2%. So there's a lot of work to do to actually move the needle on corporate giving. And one question that comes up often, so I'll just mention that you may think that corporations are giving in many other ways. It's not just their grant making through their corporate foundations to nonprofits. Some are considering sponsorships, marketing partnerships. Not all of that is measured or counted as philanthropy. And so as you build relationships with your corporate partners, it's important to also understand that the philanthropy bucket is just one resource, and that there are new channels that are emerging, and companies are sometimes willing to consider some of those other options that may not be traditional philanthropic allocations. Now, moving to the next slide, we're going to also highlight some of those opportunities ahead. In this year's report, two of the strongest performing segments of giving were international giving and giving to foundations. Let's start with international giving. We saw a almost 11% growth in current dollars in giving to international affairs. And even when we account for the 40-year high in inflation, international giving still came out ahead. What explains the relative strength of international giving is the crises around, or the range of crises around the world, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the humanitarian crises and emergency that has remained in that part of the world. Americans have given in record levels to support the relief efforts in Ukraine. And because the media has covered this crisis in a continuous way, we've also seen many donors not just give once, but sign up to give monthly to help support the efforts in Ukraine. Another big insight from the data is that international organizations have been willing to pivot during this period, implementing new technology-based ways to reach donors and engage them in their giving. There are a lot of lessons there for all types of organizations, because it does emphasize that the media can give you this moment, but then you as the organization have to determine how best to utilize that moment to retain donors and engage donors. We also saw a high rate of giving to foundations, and a lot of this reflects the past 2 years, the fact that we've had record growth in the stock market, which means that many households were in a position to make those gifts to their foundations, especially before the year end. Turning our attention to the other subsectors that grew during this period, you'll note here that healthcare, arts and culture, and also religious congregations grew in current dollars. This is really good news, because religious congregations, health, and arts and culture have some things in common that you may not automatically see. In particular, these were subsectors that were especially affected by the pandemic because they rely you'd say primarily on in-person events and fundraising. Giving to arts and culture, for example, many arts and culture organizations have in-person fundraising events and performances where they raise significant dollars. Healthcare organizations rely on runs and walks and many in-person events. So this segment of the charitable landscape was able to pivot during the pandemic and start to branch out in terms of diversifying their revenue sources, building in online mechanisms to raise funds. And as you look at the data, you see that success reflected in the numbers. Over this 2-year period, arts and culture organizations were able to bounce back from the shock of the pandemic, and that was also the case with healthcare organizations and religious congregations. All of this, I think we can really celebrate because it speaks to the innovation and the resilience that is possible within the charitable sector. As we try to put all of this data together and turn to look to the future. We are now in 2023, and we're already planning ahead for 2024 and beyond. What we know right now is that we face significant challenges. Probably the challenge that we hear a lot about in the charitable sector is the declining levels of trust. Americans trust institutions less than they have ever trusted them. And in particular, when we look at this declining trust in institutions, what's very clear is that nonprofits outperform any of their counterparts. Americans trust nonprofits more than they trust government. They trust nonprofits more than they trust business. And so nonprofits have a unique opportunity to help build and support civil society. Nonprofits can play a role in bringing people together in a world that's increasingly polarized. When we think about what role nonprofits can play, it's really about what social scientists call bridging social capital, where people can contribute towards something that's a public good. They can volunteer together to make a difference in their community. And it's also interesting that organizations, religious congregations, and or religious charitable organizations are among the most trusted in our society. Now, as we look at this trust data in relation to Giving USA, we also understand that trust is the glue of the nonprofit sector. Donors give to organizations that they trust, and also they give to individuals that they trust. So all of us working in the nonprofit sector have a role to play in continuing to build that trust. And how do we do that? By engaging with our communities, with our stakeholders, with our donors, and building authentic relationships. A key data point that emerged from our recent Lilly Family School study called What Americans Think About Philanthropy and Nonprofits also demonstrates that the general public doesn't know very much about how nonprofits work. And there's an enormous opportunity as we look ahead for nonprofits to invest more resources in telling their story, in sharing their mission with their donors, and once again, in communicating the work that they do. Don't assume that your donors know exactly what your organization does, and help enhance the storytelling that's embedded in your work. We live in an era of rising expectations. Many donors have access to information across the board on all aspects of the work that they do. So make sure that your organization is able to tell and communicate its story. And so as we put all this data together, the very last slide actually issues a bit of a call to action. As we look at the 2022 data and beyond, what's really clear is that what has led nonprofits to thrive in this economy has been their ability to innovate and to be resilient in the face of shocks. To continue to build on that record, nonprofits will also need to adapt in this environment. And when we think about what that adaptation will look like, there are really three main pillars as we think about what it means to continue to navigate and adapt and be resilient in the face of economic challenges. The first one is really thinking about the role that technology can play. During the pandemic, we saw online giving reach an inflection point with more than 10% of all giving taking place through online channels. When we look at the data, younger Americans especially are drawn to online giving forms, and we hear and see in our a large number of surveys that they're looking for more giving options. And they want to give not just through the traditional checks and cash, but they also want to give through Venmo and other payment platforms. So nonprofits need to meet donors where they are. And this is a phrase that we're going to come back to as we look at the other challenge, which is how do we build the future pipeline of donors? Our Giving USA data shows us that individuals are still the lion's share of American philanthropy. And as we unpack that data, American donors are more diverse than they've ever been. They're diverse in terms of age. We have aging donors who are reaching their prime giving years, but we also have younger donors that are beginning to start their economic and financial lives. We know that giving is habit forming. Once people start giving, it's like many other things, they continue to give throughout their lifetimes. We also have seen from our data that younger donors have a much broader understanding of what philanthropy is. They think about not just giving their time, talent, and treasure, but also using their voices, their platforms, engaging in social movements as many ways of giving back. So nonprofits also need to broaden how they build relationships with this younger cohort of donors and sustain and retain those existing donors. And then finally, we are on the cusp of a whole new range of giving tools. In preparing for this year's launch, I went back and reviewed all the early editions of Giving USA from the 50s, the 60s, and even the 1970s. And what became very clear to me is that our giving landscape and economy is more sophisticated than it's ever been. It is more complex. We have new tools, we have new opportunities, but we also face new challenges, new world and global sets of challenges in the areas of climate, in the areas of healthcare, in the areas of education. We have tools such as artificial intelligence, generative AI is the new word, that offer possibilities for nonprofits, for fundraisers, and also for donors. But what we also know is that individuals remain the bedrock of American philanthropy. And authentic engagement, true engagement with those donors remains the foundation of philanthropy. So as we think about what lies ahead on the very next slide, I'd like to invite you to share your questions. What's been surprising about the data? What are the top trends that you see? There is a Q&A button here. Please send in your questions. And we'd love to, this is probably my favorite part of the webinar, we'd love to hear from you as far as what are the key surprises? What are the top trends that you see? This is a whole, as you can see, a lot of data to unpack, but it also tells a very compelling story of a sector that's dynamic, that's resilient, and where one of the common threads through the many decades of Giving USA has been the generosity, the extraordinary generosity of Americans of all different backgrounds. So I'll stop here and we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Una. We have several questions that have come in and would open these up to you and to Rick to answer. Let's start with giving to religion was up in 2022. Does the data differentiate between giving to churches and religious nonprofits?
I will let Rick chime in.
So yeah, we get that question all the time. And giving to religion, what you have to understand about the Giving USA data, it was set up around the National Taxonomy of Exempt Entity Codes, NTEE codes. And giving to religion was defined as giving to religious congregations, denominations, religious media, and related causes. So it doesn't pick up, for example, supporting a religious university. That would come under education, or take organizations like World Vision, which is well known, many people give to World Vision for religious reasons, but in reality, it's categorized under international affairs. So you're primarily looking at, again, giving to religious congregations is the bulk of that, along with religious media and denominational support.
Thanks, Rick. Another question. Given the reduced economic ability of some mid-level and even major donors, what strategy is recommended? Finding new donors, asking for reduced amounts of gifts or gift amounts, belt tightening? What would be an appropriate strategy given that landscape?
Let me chime in here and see that the economic data suggests that not all households are affected the same. So I would say this is a good time to know your donor, understand how they're impacted by this economy, and use the data very carefully. So in general, what this means is start with those, may sound very elementary, but start with those conversations with donors to understand where they are in their particular gift making and grant making strategies. For those donors that have, for example, a donor advised fund, they've already made that commitment to charity. So the current economic circumstances aren't going to affect their ability to give. Similarly, if they have a family foundation, this is for your high net worth donors, their foundations are usually based on a 2 to 3 year rolling average. So a current downturn doesn't affect them. In general, what we have seen is that in downturns and periods of economic challenge, it's probably more important to build relationships with donors. And don't assume that just because there's a risk of a recession that your donors are not interested in giving. What we saw during the Great Recession is that organizations that maintained and in fact built maintain their commitment to their donors, to engagement, to building relationships, came out much stronger after the recession, were able to recover. Now, having said that, on a very practical note, if there are donors that may need to perhaps adjust their giving amounts, one strategy that we've really seen work is, as I referred to in the webinar, the monthly subscription models, where a donor can commit a certain amount every month. And that has actually proved to be a very good strategy. Amazon and Netflix have pioneered this in some ways, and it's become quite common for many donors to sign up for that sort of commitment. But the key here is understanding the donor's situation, having those conversations, and then tailoring your approach to that circumstance. I think the key phrase is meet donors where they are. If they're not able to give in this current landscape, think about future opportunities. Planned giving turns out to be one of those great opportunities because they can commit to future streams of income rather than giving right now.
Thank you, Una. Another question that just came in from one of our attendees. What trends are you seeing for sustainer giving? And we'll expand on that just a little bit. I am curious, what % of my file should be giving on a recurring basis?
It's a good question. And we've actually done quite a bit of research around this over the years. And what we find, and Una mentioned this, is this idea of sustained giving is actually interesting, is that the younger the donor, the more likely they are to want to give a monthly gift. And our comparative data shows that millennials in particular, and then Gen Z, and are more likely than Gen X and especially boomers to take on a monthly gift. And just overall, donors are more likely to want to give an occasional gift among any generation than to give a monthly gift. So it's a subset of overall giving, obviously. But what's really fascinating as you begin to think about it, and I think Una mentioned this just now, is I think we have a generation that has grown up willing to put a monthly subscription on their credit card. I've been in the industry long enough to remember when credit card giving first came into vogue, and there was quite an argument within the industry of whether that was even ethical, because you're asking people to take on debt, if you would, by putting money on their or gift on their credit card rather than giving you cash or check. The whole point is that the older generations, they may have had a subscription that was more likely to be an annual subscription, not a monthly subscription. Whereas the younger generations, again, are more likely and being used to doing a monthly subscription on credit cards. So I think that's part of the dynamic that's at play. As far as a percentage, I think it completely depends on the kind of organization you represent and the case for support that you can make around a monthly gift and what it does. We work with organizations where the overwhelming majority of their donors, 80%, 85% are monthly givers, and we work with organizations where 10% are monthly givers. So again, it kind of goes back to the kind of organization. I don't know, Una, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think you've covered a lot of ground. What we have seen, and perhaps we can share this with your team, is that many more organizations are considering that monthly model simply because it allows them to engage a different segment of giving. And it's important to actually, this is a time for we've lived through a lot of change, but it's also a time to kind of lean into some experimentation to see what works best for your organization. And you can do some simple testing to see the types of messages, the types of engagement opportunities that will work for your donors. I have also seen, and we've actually tested this, the messaging that really works for those monthly donors. And so if you are still sort of trying to think about how best to approach this, I would encourage you to put on sort of that resilience and innovation approach and really look at what is possible, especially given the fact that younger donors especially are drawn to these monthly approaches.
Thank you, Una. And Rick, several questions coming in now. Everyone's using the Q&A button at the top of their webinar viewer, and we thank you for that. It's great to see participation. Our next question, are challenge campaigns an effective way to enhance giving? What issues does a challenge campaign create for the nonprofit?
So I'll jump on this one. Yeah, we have not only tested this quite extensively, but we've also researched it, and what we have found is that donors of every generation, but especially younger donors, are motivated by incentives such as a challenge. And I'm not quite sure what the second part of the question about what kind of a challenge does it represent or concern for the nonprofit. I just think you need to make sure that if it's whether it's a match or a challenge. A match would be money that's been offered. If it can be matched, then it will be given. A challenge is money that's already been given, and now you're trying to meet that challenge. And I would just make sure that you're really clear in your language on that.
Thank you, Rick. Here's another question. This one about Giving USA, the annual report. Does the report provide insight for support for capital campaigns as well as mission-based support?
So I can start, but certainly have Rick chime in. The report has quite a bit of information on capital campaigns, but to get into that data, you'll have to look at the chapters. We have a whole chapter on education, giving to education, which covers a lot of the work around capital campaigns and also giving by individuals. I will also emphasize that during the past few years, really, we've seen a shift towards what we call value-based donors, or maybe cause-based donors. Many donors are making their decisions about their giving based on the mission of the organization and how that aligns with their own values. This is very different from what we saw maybe at the beginning of the 21st century and before the Great Recession, where many households would really want to support the organizations that they've always supported in the past. Increasingly, when donors make decisions, they want them to align with their values. So maybe they want to give to climate, and that's a cause. Rather than picking an organization, they want to find the organizations that are making a difference in that area. So the takeaway here is that focusing on your mission is more important than ever, communicating that mission, but also doing your homework on how that aligns with the donors that you work with to ensure that your messaging lines up with what's important to those donors.
Thank you, Una. Here's another question. Do you have any suggestions on acquisition strategies we should consider given the current economic landscape to address and mitigate churn in our files? We've been focusing on engaging our existing donors, but are noticing a decline in new folks coming into our organization.
That's a really good question. I think everybody's sensing the headwinds that we're facing economically, and our data science division's been parsing some of the data, and what we're seeing, actually two trends. One is a softening in the response rates to donor acquisition, and the channels that I know the clients that we work with primarily are using our direct mail. It still tends to be an effective channel, especially using the modeling that we're doing, along with digital advertising. We've found to be a successful medium as well. Radio campaigns have worked fairly well, and direct email campaigns, they've softened a bit. The point that we're seeing is, again, a bit of a pullback in terms of the number of donors who are engaging, and we've also seen a decline in the average gift. And I think that speaks to what people are feeling. A year ago, we did a donor confidence study, and then what popped to the surface in terms of why people said they would be giving less was inflation. And that's when inflation was just beginning. And now what we're seeing is this year's study is showing that it's because of personal financial situations. And what that means is that inflation's having an impact. And I think we're seeing that across the board.
One last question to pose to you both. I'm reading this year that overall 2022 giving of $499 billion is down from 2021's $516 billion. Yet when I look at Giving USA's 2021 infographic of overall data, the amount raised in 2021 says $484.85 billion, which makes 2022 giving appear to be higher than 2021. A little technical question here. Are we mixing up before inflation and after inflation numbers?
I love this question because this listener and this participant is a data person. And so, first of all, thank you for paying such close attention to the data. Let me just clarify very quickly that Giving USA is an estimate and it's revised. So what we found out with the newest information that we have, as the government revises its numbers, we also have to revise our numbers for the past. And it turns out that 2021 was an even better year than we initially estimated. And in fact, turns out to be one of the best giving years ever. Giving crossed that $500 billion mark. So there's a lot to celebrate because during this global pandemic, there was record generosity, which is not a story that many have told. So I think it's important to tell that story. Now, these Giving USA numbers are revised when we get new information. And so just to keep in mind that because 2021 turned out to be an even better year, that's why those numbers have gone up for 2021. And for the 2022 numbers, also important to recognize that why the numbers are down compared to the highs achieved during the pandemic is based on the latest economic data that we have access to.
Thank you, Una. Another question. A couple of questions have come in, so here we go with a couple of more. If this one relevant to digital giving options. If younger donors are attracted to digital giving options, are they less interested in attending in-person fundraising events? Also, because of COVID, are our donors so used to not meeting that others are seeing a decline in an interest for in-person meetings?
Again, I think it completely depends on the charitable organization. As Una said, there are certain sectors like arts and culture that depend heavily on in-person, and I think would still thrive on that, along with education. I think the in-person. I think the bigger issue is there is a shift, and the data pointed to this, and Una mentioned is there's a bit of a shift going on in terms of donors increasingly giving online, and it follows consumer behavior. And part of what we strongly encourage folks to do, in fact, looking at some of our data on the generational giving, What's very fascinating is the percentage of donors who have now given a gift through their smartphone. Almost 50% of millennials have used their smartphone to give a gift. Point being that you have to make sure everything is mobile optimized and it's designed for mobile first. So whether that's your email, your website, anything that you're doing digitally, your giving form has got to be mobile optimized and designed for mobile first.
One last question that's come in, and this is with respect to giving by corporations and giving by individuals. If we're surprised to see, maybe surprised at the relatively steady percentage of giving by corporations, would it be appropriate to assume that giving by individuals would increase, given what we know now, as their income and ability to give their income increases, and particularly in light of inflation, if inflation decreases, would we expect to see increased levels of giving from individuals?
Yes, absolutely. I want to emphasize that individuals do give when they have the resources and the financial as well as economic resources to give. And individuals have a lot more options in terms of how they give than they have ever had in the past. And to emphasize that, I think the key is to understand individuals can give, of course, an annual gift. They can also make a planned gift. And keep in mind that for many donors, they also have access to gift vehicles, donor advised funds being the most, I guess, well-known and widely used. Now, in the question, there's also the idea of individuals at different life stages. In particular, individuals that are looking at retirement. And here, what's interesting is that there are a number of new tools that individuals that are facing retirement, thinking about retirement, can also think about. Of course, trusts, legacy gifts, and so forth are among those options. But what we're finding is that it's important to start having those conversations with donors before they start to retire. And for donors that are interested in maintaining their levels of charitable giving, what are the giving vehicles that are available to them so that they can continue to give at the same levels that they did while they were working? And what's been, I think, very exciting to see in the giving landscape is that there's been a lot of innovation. So it's not static, and colleges and universities have been, I think, attuned to this, but many other nonprofits are really using many of these different vehicles, developing messages for those aging, older donors so that they have a menu of options. It's not just one way, but many different ways that you can give as well.
Thank you, Una. Here's a question about donor communication channels and activity channels. Is there a clear trend away from email communication and toward text message communication with donors? Is email going the way of snail mail?
Let me jump on that one. First of all, our data shows that direct mail actually is still welcomed by donors. In fact, the generation that wants to receive a monthly direct mail piece from the organizations they support are millennials. And they're the most likely generation to want that. But all generations welcome a direct mail letter from organizations that they support. Secondly, we are seeing a growth in the likelihood of responding to a text from 2016 to 2022. That jumped from 2.9% on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being highly unlikely, 5 being highly likely. Back in 2016, it scored a 2.9 for millennials. Now it's up to 3.4. And they're saying that they would welcome a monthly text. I think the challenge with the email, again, for those of us who remember years ago when pre-internet and everybody mailed, that's the way you communicated. The mailbox was stuffed full with mail every day, and that's our inbox today. So I think standing out in email is an increasing challenge. Frankly, if you show up in somebody's mailbox today, you'll probably be one of the only things they're going to see. So we're seeing direct mail being incredibly effective. The way I would answer it ultimately is you have to be good at communicating through all channels. Our data shows that somebody who connects with you through multiple channels, engages with you through multiple channels, has twice the lifetime value of those who don't. So it is direct mail, it's email, and it's text, for sure.
Thanks, Rick. This ends our Q&A session for today, and I'd like to thank you, Una and Rick, for these helpful insights into Giving USA 2023, the annual report on philanthropy. And if you have not yet subscribed to Giving USA, you can do so at givingusa.org. Your annual subscription gives you complete access to the entire archive of Giving USA digital products, including all past Giving USA reports, free digital copies of all special reports, and access to special webinars around relevant nonprofit topics. In addition, you get exclusive access to an interactive dashboard that allows you to compare and contrast giving trends since 1981 against household income, CPI, GDP, and much more. Finally, in the email you'll receive containing a link to the recording of the webinar, you will also find a link to subscribe. Feel free to share both links with your friends and colleagues. Thank you again for joining us for this Dunham and Company webinar on Giving USA 2023, the annual report on philanthropy. Have a great day.